All right, all set.
All right, thank you. 1984's album catalog reads like a Rolling Stone ranking of iconic 20th century records. Madonna's star was starting to burn even brighter with their second album, Like a Virgin. Metallica was redefining metal with their sophomore release, Ride the Lightning. Prince was busy creating his career-defining masterwork, Purple Rain. Bruce Springsteen was soaring up the charts and firmly into America's consciousness with Born in the USA. Run DMC was cultivating modern hip-hop's ethos with their self-titled debut. And Van Halen was ushering in futuristic sounds while holding a tight grip on rock and roll staples, further accurately titled 1984. By the time the mid-'80s rolled around, the Pasadena, California foursome was in need of a serious recharge. Not that they were yesterday's news by any stretch, but it was clear the group had hit a creative speed bump. Their 1982 effort, Diver Down, faced some backlash for having too many covers and not being as fierce as much of their earlier work. To this point, their biggest album by far was their major label introduction, Van Halen 1, which was released in February of 1978. Since exploding onto the scene with that first record, Van Halen had a new album out each year, like clockwork, from 1978 through 1982. But 1983 came and went without a new Van Halen LP, which gave the group time to recharge their batteries and unleash not only one of the most successful records in their catalog, but created one of the personifying albums for the newly formed MTV generation. Guitar god Eddie Van Halen was ready to push the envelope and expand the band's sound. With his trusty, homemade, red, white, black, striped Fender Stratocaster guitar, nicknamed Frankenstein, the mad scientist rocker went into his laboratory to crescent his new home studio, 5150. Eddie kickstarted Van Halen's next project, and along with charismatic frontman David Lee Roth, the golden-voiced bassist Michael Anthony, his bombastic drummer of her brother Alex, Eddie concocted Van Halen's sixth studio album. 1984 became an era-defining record that masterfully fused synthesizers with guitars, drums, and suggestive lyrics to capture the spirit of the 1980s music scene. Hello, I am Chad Jones, and welcome to Don't Scratch the Vinyl, a music podcast where myself and occasionally a guest break down an iconic album in its entirety. This show both lays out the historical significance of the record and what music fans can take from the album today. I am recording this episode at Big Night Media's studio in Boston, Massachusetts. If you listened to my first episode, you know I am a huge fan of Van Halen. I first really started getting into their music in middle school, where I wore out the Runnin' with the Devil and Panama music videos on my iPod Touch. The more familiar I got with their sound, the bigger fan I became. And I started to thoroughly dive into the Roth-era catalog with Eddie's passing in 2020. I was pretty solidified as a card-carrying member of Van Halen 1's fan club, as I much preferred the hard rock tenacity over their synth-laced album. As is the case with many bands that have multiple iconic albums at different stages of their career, Van Halen fanatics will have a slight favorite between the group's first album and 1984. But after really marinating with this record, both when I wrote a long-form piece for its 40th anniversary last year, as well as listening to and thinking about it a ton while preparing for this episode, my appreciation is only strengthened. I'm not sure if it has taken over their debut effort in my heart, but 1984 has some classic Van Halen elements, while also cultivating a fresh chapter for the band. So, as I mentioned in the opening, Eddie Van Halen was looking to add new elements to this album. Being the virtuoso musician that he was, he started tinkering with synthesizers and keyboards to intertwine with the band's guitar, drum-driven persona. Diamond Dave was against using the new instrumental elements, as he thought moving away from the band's classic hard rock sound would turn off a significant portion of their fans. But Eddie was determined to include these new features on the record. He had attempted to bring these facets to Van Halen in 1981, but the other members of the band had turned down the idea. But this time around, Eddie got his wish, and was able to add new electronic toys to concoct an extra layer for their new album. Titled 1984, it will always have a connection to George Orwell's book of the same name. The futuristic man and machine elements are woven throughout the album. On January 9th, 1984, Van Halen's sixth and ultimately last album to include the original quartet was released to the masses. The album starts with a 68-second futuristic instrumental that shares the record's name and is full of intriguing bends and weaves. It almost evokes feelings of the upcoming digital age, giving off similar vibes to standing in line when you're on Space Mountain. It was a bold decision to have this number bat lead off, and while it's considered a throwback now, 4 decades from its release, there is enough sci-fi elements to conjure up thoughts of maybe this is what 3084 could sound like. It does set the stage for an Orwellian aura that this record would dive in and out of. And ultimately, this song serves as a purpose of setting the groundwork and highlighting the obvious. Van Halen has entered a new chapter. I'm curious how many people seek out this song on its own when you go on YouTube to pull it up by itself, because it just fits like an absolute glove when paired to the iconic Jump, the second track on 1984. This is where the synth blends perfectly with the rock tenacity that Eddie Van Halen would be able to puncture through his songs. And the keyboards, the melody, all of it blends together to create a really catchy and incredible melody. So Eddie gets to show off the techniques he learned from his first instrument, which was the piano, on the keyboard and with the guitar. His 10 digits are working overtime on this track for Van Halen. And it's one of the best solos of his career. I think it's interesting that when we talk about the next synth-filled song on 1984, that Eddie really put some time and thought into the solo. I think almost as a little bit of a acknowledgement to the metalheads out there that liked Van Halen, that they weren't going to go too far away from their original hard rockin' sound. Simply, it's just hard not to have a smile on your face when you're listening to Jump. It just evokes feelings of joy. Now, David Lee Roth is not to be forgotten on this track. His lyrics and affect fit within the fabric of the song to an absolute T. Also, it gives some interesting insight into how David Lee Roth would pen the lyrics of Van Halen songs. So he basically had an idea of banking concepts, where he would write down slogans, quotes, any ideas literally into a notebook, and then would save them for when Van Halen brought him music. And he would come up with the lyrics basically exclusively for Van Halen's music. And so there are 2 stories connected to where he got the inspiration for Jump, 2 wide-ranging variances. On one side, which he said multiple times, he got the inspiration for the song from a story about a suicidal man. He's also hinted that the song was inspired by a stripper. Either work for Van Halen really works for their mythology. Only these guys could make a song about a suicidal person sound joyful. Or they were the only group that could have a song about a stripper and a call girl on an album named after a George Orwell novel. But the inspiration is not as important as the meaning. It really hits home that point of you want to jump into life with no regrets. And that really hits home with Van Halen's entire musical ethos. But it does have a complicated history with Van Halen fans, especially for the die-hard number out there. It is their only #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100, and it is by far, their biggest song on YouTube with over 272 million views. This is not a straight example, though, that only has problems in Van Halen's musical catalog. There's a lot of famous bands and musicians that are sometimes often overshadowing the rest of their catalog if they produce one truly iconic, great song. The Eagles with Hotel California is a good example where a lot of people will automatically assume and associate them with that song, even though there's plenty of other great tunes in their catalog as well. But the problem with Jump being Van Halen's #1 song is that it's not quite indicative of their entire catalog, especially the ones with Roth on lead vocals. Not that it's a bad song by any stretch, but I could see the frustration for diehard Van Halen fans of thinking when Eddie passed away in 2020 that it's the Jump video that is playing on news sites. That wasn't really who they were in their core. They were not a pop-laced, synth-driven band their entire career. So it is a very, very important song for Van Halen's catalog, but it's going to cause some tension depending on how much of a fan you really are of the band's other work. Now, jumping underneath to the number 3 song on 1984. We're going south of the border for Panama. And it is just one of the most riveting, intoxicating intros and riffs in not only Van Halen's musical catalog, but of rock and roll in general. Eddie's smooth rhythm combined with slick slides, especially at the intro, really make Frankenstein cry. There's not a lot of overly instrumental songs that can be just driven through home with as punchy of a guitar riff as Panama. And there are a lot of other almost complicated songs on 1984 from a musical standpoint, but Panama is the most digestible, straightforward, cleanest rock track. It's very, very simple to follow along with the guitar parts, the drumming, and then the singing. And other songs that I'll mention later on, there's a lot of other intricate details going on with Van Halen's music, but for Panama, the guitar riff, drums, and lyrics fit so smooth together, and it concocts one of their better songs. And it's just an unbelievable 80s hard rockin' classic with the feel-good lyrics, the monster drumming. Van Halen does a really good job on this track of also the build and release of tension. It's almost very sensual. And we got to mention some of the lyrics here. As Roth has said that the song is about a car, but the lyrics will always be connected to women as well, as lines like, "Don't you know she's coming home with me? You'll lose her in the turn." He might have been talking about a car, but it's easy to see where the connections to beautiful girls came through with Van Halen songs, especially with Panama. Now, speaking of cars, fun fact, that Eddie's 1972 Mira S Lamborghini is actually incorporated into the song. During the Running a Little Bit Hot Tonight part, there's almost an element of like a blow dryer song where you can really hear like a whoosh. And I always thought that it was actually a blow dryer that they recorded for that song. But I heard recently in an interview that he had before he passed that it was his own car making that noise. Now, jumping back into Roth, his swagger and presence just oozes throughout the number. But it doesn't smother and overshadow the Van Halen brothers' intricate and incredible musical talents. There are some times where they wouldn't be necessarily battling with each other, but sometimes it would be considered more of an Eddie song or a Roth song. I'll even talk about that a couple times on this episode. But on this one, they just combined to create the magic that really was Van Halen with David Lee Roth on lead vocals. Getting personal for a second, this was really the song I think that drove home that I was a big, big, big fan and wanted to hear more of Van Halen. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but this one means the most to me, I think, of any song on 1984, and it's up there with any song that's in their any record that they produced. I love it. I never get tired of it. There are some songs where I listen to a lot and can eventually get worn out by. I never get tired of hearing Panama. It's also an all-time MTV music video. I mean, the outfits that they were wearing on stage, Roth at one point shows off a t-shirt that just has his face on it. The bit where all 4 of the guys at one point are swinging through a hanging wire overlooking the stage. Michael Anthony has his bass in the shape of a Jack Daniel's whiskey bottle, and it's just the peak of 1980s musical excess. And one of the best crescendos in rock history with the "ain't no stopping now" build and just eruption into pure 80s awesomeness. And if you don't like Panama, you probably don't like Van Halen in general. You probably don't like classic rock, and you arguably just don't like fun. Going from Panama to number 4 on 1984, Top Jimmy. There's an intimate guitar intro, and then the music intensity picks up and then drops throughout. There's some interesting scratches that Eddie can whine out of his guitar, especially on the solo. He really milks it out perfectly. But this is definitely a David Lee Roth-driven song. As Roth tells the story about Top Jimmy and the Rhythm Pigs, which is a real group. And this song also gives insight into David Lee Roth's not only writing, but his persona as not just a singer, but as a frontman. As Roth mentions how, in quotes, driving all the women crazy, he's got the look, and he's got the sound that everybody digs. The fact that Roth mentions how the women love him and that his persona and swagger are as important as the song and the sounds that he actually makes on stage is interesting, because that is actually how a lot of Van Halen fans would categorize David Lee Roth, in that he wasn't necessarily maybe the most beautifully trained classical singer, But what he had was an aura about himself that he could lead a group of rock and roll fans into a party, into a good time, on and off the stage. So I think that's interesting that for Roth, he's diving into that topic almost from an above angle. And also, I really wanted to mention this point as well, that a lot of David Lee Roth's vocals are sung from his point of view. A few examples: on Beautiful Girls, all I need is a beautiful girl. Everybody wants some. I want some too. On Unchained, this is my chance to fly. There's a lot of me lyrics associated with David Lee Roth's writing style. But Top Jimmy is a break from that. It's very similar to Jamie's Crying, where Dave is hearing about Jimmy and Jamie and then singing about them. He's not necessarily involved with this story. He's a different writer than a lot of other classic rock icons. Tom Petty, Paul McCartney, Bob Dylan. A lot of their most important and memorable songs are driven through characters, not necessarily them as the lead of their story. But Roth is such a character himself that he had to include himself in a lot of the stories. But not on this one. And I think it's interesting that on this album, he points out an entirely different character to sing about. That's not a woman and that he's not necessarily involved with. Number 5 on 1984 is Drop Dead Legs. Kick-ass Van Halen at their absolute best. There's a slow build for the intro before a punchy guitar riff and really steady drumming just take the track to another whole nother level. Eddie and Alex's pacing, their timing, their chemistry is just impeccable. How they feed off each other is brilliant, and it's a huge part of why Van Halen was able to drive not only such a great melody through the rhythm section, but also into their solos, how those guys were just on the same wavelength all the time. Obviously, being brothers helped, but the fact that they were able to intertwine their family heritage into their music to make sure that they were really on track every single time and on the same page together is what makes them one of the most memorable bands in American rock history. Not to be overdone, there's a lot of great charisma that Roth flows out of in this song. Talking about the legs, smile, and derriere right away in the lyrics, it's clear where he got his attention. And one of the best vocal deliveries, not only on 1984, but also in the Van Halen canon, is I get nothing but the shakes over you. And how he articulates the shakes really drives home the track. And it's very memorable. I love listening to that when I was going through this album a lot of times, getting ready for this episode. And Roth is just in his bag with a few other references that only he could really hit on. He mentions at one point Betty Boop. I don't see a lot of modern-day musicians bringing up that cartoon in their songs. And the plenty of confidence is just preening out of him. The oohs and ahs make the track that much better. And also, Roth's antics and music blend just so perfectly together. They don't stand out as separate, as there's always a little bit of tension between having to share the spotlight between Eddie and Dave. But I think on the really, really great and memorable Van Halen tracks, that they're feeding off each other and not competing with each other. And on this one, it's perfect of exactly what the song needs. Roth and Eddie were able to find that connection and then drive it home. I've been talking about this album and Van Halen for way too long before I bring up Michael Anthony, the bassist, the often overlooked bassist, and his incredible voice and backing harmonies. It's a huge underrated part of Van Halen's sound and what drove them into not only being popular with guys, but also with women. And on Classic, one of their all-time favorites with harmonies from my standpoint is Drop Dead Legs. And just name a Van Halen song and you'll probably find unbelievable backing harmonies from Michael Anthony. Feel Your Love Tonight, Dance the Night Away might be the most famous one. Mean Street, there's so many where his smooth, honey-coated voice can bring a little bit of sincerity and sensuality as opposed to Roth's more aggressive form of singing and aggressive style on stage. That type of smoothness, I think, was a huge part of why they resonated so much with women of all generations. And also on this specific song, the harmonies are "When the night is through, will I still be loving you?" ? Right? And I think it's very interesting that Eddie and Michael were the ones doing the harmonies for this exact point, as in 1984, those guys were both married at the time they recorded this song. Whereas famously, David Lee Roth is a lifelong bachelor and is not married to this day. And I think it's an interesting little insight that they were the ones that had to mention the part about after the conquest of a great night with this girl, what's the aftermath? David Lee Roth didn't have to concern himself with that nearly as much as the guys who were married in Van Halen did. And I think that's a very interesting little nugget for showing the dynamics of not only these guys as musicians, but as people. As we all know, David Lee Roth was more concerned with the pursuit than the consequences, as Diamond Dave ain't talking about love. We know that. The 6th track on 1984 is just unbelievable. Hot for Teacher. An iconic drum intro that is up there with Pantheon-level drum intros. I think of Alex on Hot for Teacher in the same categories I think of John Bonham on Led Zeppelin's song When the Levee Breaks, or Ringo Starr on The Beatles Come Together. It is up there with some of the absolute best, most known drum tracks to start a song. And I mean, we can't forget about Eddie on this one. His shredding is really showing why he was the last true guitar god. And the brothers are playing off each other perfectly. They have a great rhythm and then know exactly when to add that extra little spice to really ramp up the track. And they drive their instruments into just pure eruptions of music euphoria. And it's an absolute classic, not only in Van Halen's catalog, but in any era of rock. And now there's an interesting little insight also to it. This stage, the technology that was available during recording studios time, that Eddie was able to have multiple tracks laid down for different solos, where he would come in and be able to screw around and really have creativity in the studio. Whereas before, when they were laying the tracks just on one 8-track, Eddie would have to have basically a solo already written for the studio, go in there, record it, and then that would be it for the song. But by the time the mid-'80s were here, he would be able to record multiple tracks, and then for the studio part, mess around with what he was going to include in the actual song that would end up on the album. And this created just some absolute virtuosity from him, and he was really able to take the guitar to new heights. And that's why sometimes that you'll see him on stage or during music videos when he's trying to mimic the sounds, is that his hand will be up on top of the guitar fretboard and then immediately slide down and immediately come back up again. And that is in large part because he was able to really pay attention to all parts of the guitar for these solos, and then he would have to really, really be dialed in, though, on learning it, because he might have created a solo that would be impossible to play until Eddie got his hands on the guitar, and then it wasn't so impossible anymore. And I think on the Hot for Teacher solo, it best shows off his improvising, his soulful taps, and it really shines through on this one. Speaking of tapping, it's very interesting that Eddie is often associated with bringing tapping to guitar play with his right hand and left hand on the fretboard. But he never claimed to invent it. He actually saw Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin performing at the Forum one time with his left hand on the guitar neck and his right hand was in the air. And so something went off in his brain that he's like, I could do that. And being the classically trained piano player that he was, he would almost be able to see the guitar as a piano. And bringing in all 10 fingers to be able to articulate the notes at the same time without even needing a pick, as he saw his right fingers as basically an extension of his left hand. And he was able to pull off so many different tricks with the guitar, in large part because of a necessity, where he did not grow up with the ability to buy fancy pedals and other gadgets to incorporate into his songs. He had to do it all by himself. And it's very interesting that his musical hero was his father, showing the hard work ethic that you got to do things by yourself. And his guitar hero was Eric Clapton, especially when he was with Cream. And in large part because Eddie was turned on by the fact that Clapton would just plug in his guitar and go from there. There wasn't a lot of extra intricate gizmos and gadgets that were needed to get the song really pumping for Eric Clapton. And Eddie saw it the same way. He had a quote one time saying, "I did everything I could to get the sounds out of the guitar with my fingers." And Lord, did he ever accomplish that. His solo on Hot for Teacher is just face-melting. I feel like whenever I listen to it, I become one of the bad guys at the end of Indiana Jones when they open the Ark of the Covenant and their faces just completely melt off. Jaw's just on the floor whenever I'm fortunate enough to hear this. Cannot forget about Diamond Dave on this track. His talk-singing vocal delivery, especially at the beginning when he's talking to the kids about what do you think the teacher's going to look like this year, is possibly the best form of that way of singing on any Van Halen song. It's certainly up there for the discussion. And how he accentuates and articulates the notes with a little bit of vocal fry, that California cool delivery, really summed up what he was all about as a singer. And of course, that grunt that would make Lisa Ann blush is just otherworldly. It's like, it's hard to listen to this song when there's significant others around. The video, all-timer, with the teachers, the blonde bombshell teachers strutting on top of the lunch tables and the desks. The four guys that were dressed up as the Van Halen doppelgangers, just being entranced throughout the whole time. Love it. That was a great idea. And then during the solo part where the four boys are inside the library and how Eddie walks down the table, just giving one of the best solos in music history, and how the boys have their jaws drop as if they're a cartoon character is just crazy. So Eddie Van Halen and company, they cracked the code. How do you get middle school boys to pay attention in class? Hot blonde teachers, Eddie Van Halen guitar solos. That's how. This song also represents a huge part of why a lot of people resonate with Van Halen's music and why it connected with so many people throughout the decades is they did not take themselves seriously. They were not afraid to have a little bit of fun and dive into the more humorous side of rock and roll, but they took their careers very seriously. And it's really clear during this recording and during this video that they were having a lot of fun, yes, but they were also masters at their craft. Number 7 on 1984 is I'll Wait. So this is definitely a more mature sounding Van Halen song. There's more synth that intertwine with the rock elements and it comes off beautifully. There's not a lot of songs in 1984 that I would classify as beautiful. I'll Wait is probably the closest one to it. It's a very steady, driving beat that rocks through this track. It gives off vibes almost to an 80s boxing training montage. I could definitely see Sylvester Stallone playing Rocky and running through the beach while he fist bumps through the air, trying to get in shape. Now, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's interesting that for this track as well, there's some really soulful playing from Eddie, especially on the guitar solos. This is not just a synth track that completely outshines his ability to shred the sixth string. And it comes off as, I think, a little bit of a nod that both times that they really incorporated synth on this track, that he wanted to make sure all of his metal heads got a little bit of a belly rub, that he was trying to appease them as well. They weren't completely just becoming a top 40 track and band going forward. Roth is interesting on this one as well. There's some more sensitive lyrics with I'll Wait Till Your Love Comes Down, and the vocal delivery, especially on the chorus, sounds very sincere and almost melancholy, as much as David Lee Roth could muster. And there's really some sensitivity in this song that doesn't always come through in Van Halen's lyrics. And I think it shines through brilliantly in this one. And also this, I think it highlights how good of a singer David Lee Roth actually was. He beautifully hits the high notes, especially on the chorus. I think it's true that he's really trying to push through and drive to hit them exactly where they needed to be. A little bit of a sliding glass door theory also with this song is that this would be the last time that Roth would sing on a Van Halen record until 2012. And there's almost an interesting little note too. Would this have been what Van Halen would have sounded like had David Lee Roth stuck around? And maybe through the 80s, if they didn't go with Sammy Hagar, how would Van Halen have balanced having still Roth now entering their 30s and slightly more mature and definitely a different stage of their careers? And maybe they could have been more like this. A little bit more sincerity, still great instrumental play, but not quite as tongue-in-cheek as some of their other more memorable tracks. Touch on this a little bit more in another category. Very smart placement, I think, of the album, how they go in between two really, really hard rockin' tunes to include the synth. I don't think it would have been smart to include 1984, Jump, and I'll Wait too close to each other. I think it was smart how they spread them out. Now, jumping through the second to last track on 1984, Girl Gone Bad. And this is where the guys are just firing off on all cylinders. The intro weaves in and out of both a touching and frantic state of mind, and every time I was listening to it, preparing for this episode, I would be hooked immediately with just the intro, let alone all the other dynamic qualities that this song has. And the song is about a sex worker. And it's like, hey, before OnlyFans and Tinder, you had to get a little creative, right? The chemistry between the four guys here is just unmatched. It's very complicated, yet not overly muddled. I wanted to make this point of a few songs in Van Halen's earlier albums, I think especially, as they were trying to find their way to record great songs and albums in the studio, is that sometimes, I think it's fair to say that they threw a little bit too much into the plan. There was maybe a couple times, like I'm on Fire is a good example, and Atomic Punk on their first record, where they didn't quite hit all the proper tunes of balance. It could come off as a little bit too muddled, or even a little bit annoying. They didn't always quite play off each other, I think, to the best extent of their abilities on a few songs earlier on in their careers. But even though there's a ton going on Girl Gone Bad and a lot of really intricate details and slides and taps from Eddie and the build-up by Alex and the vocal deliveries from Dave and the sweet lyrics that are building through the harmonies by Mike, it doesn't sound too congested. I really think it does a good job of incorporating a lot of classic Van Halen elements while still not overwhelming the listener. I think that was a really, really important part of this song that really attracted me to it, honestly. And there's new details that stand out on each listening. Van Halen didn't have a ton of really simple songs where you just get lost in the melody and then there's a couple catchy choruses and then you were done. Is that Eddie was constantly incorporating new tricks into his guitar work. And I think the more you listen to this song, especially if you have headphones on to really get dialed in on both parts, that you can find interesting things that jump out to you every single time. And the harmonies. Got to shout out the harmonies again for Mike and Ed to a certain degree, but really Anthony is driving home the girl underneath where Roth is pointing the little prods of Girl Gone Bad. And it just bleeds perfectly together. Perfectly. Speaking of working really well together, Eddie and Dave had this very unique timing on certain Van Halen songs where there'd be a little bit of a musical break where Eddie would be tapping his guitar or sliding through after Roth sang or basically said something on the song. Hot for Teacher is a great example of, I think of all the education that I miss, but none of my homework was ever quite like this, and Eddie responds in kind. It was almost like those guys were talking to each other in a language they only understood. And I think that's fascinating, as Lord knows those guys had issues as people and as bandmates. They didn't always see eye to eye on Van Halen's musical prowess. They didn't always see eye to eye as people in general and how to live life. But despite all their issues together, they had an unbelievable connection when they were recording their songs. And they were like this. They were one and one at a few times during special parts of Van Halen songs. Great example shines through on this track, on the part that has Dave singing, "Found that girl with a lonesome John, but she should have been with me. Guess that woman fall in love, she don't work for free." And then a plethora of Ed guitar scratches, almost like he's tapping a nail with a hammer into the wall, where he's got to be delicate enough to not bring down the wall, but hard enough where he really drives the nail into the drywall. And it's just a perfect build-up and release of tension that those guys were just on the same wavelength for this one. And throw on top of that the Alex drums that just bash right into a brilliant chorus of the golden voice Michael Anthony. And it's one of the best sequences on the album. And I think that this also points out a criticism that I don't think is always really fair with Van Halen, as some people will comment that they didn't always have solos that really hit home for the song itself. Eddie would be criticized for almost being overly indulgent for his guitar work, like he was just using the solos as a time to masturbate with his guitar and show off how good he was. But I really don't think that's a fair criticism for most Van Halen songs. I honestly think that the solos lead perfectly into what the group was trying to accomplish for that specific track. And Girl Gone Bad's another brilliant example. And I think if you have that issue with Van Halen, if you're one of those people that don't think that they often communicate great solos after choruses and melodies that really lead into a song that makes sense in the end, I would listen to Girl Gone Bad. I think it just shows off that all four guys were at the peak of their powers at this point in their career, and everybody does their job to a T on this track. Closing out 1984, House of Pain. Now, this is definitely the sleaziest guitar riff of anything off 1984. It's a very hard rock and 70s style song. It almost reminds me of Joe Perry's work on mid-70s Aerosmith with, think of Toys in the Attic or his iconic Walk This Way, where it's a little grimy. It's definitely not as polished as some of their earlier work on the album here. And I think it's the best song that if you could put onto their first record, House of Pain, I think, fits the best if you would plug it right behind maybe Ain't Talking About Love. Alex's drumming is just so clean. The fills are perfect, and he adds just the right amount of cowbell to make Christopher Walken happy. And now Dave is showing his more dominant side with the lyrics after being maybe a little bit more submissive or hesitant on the previous 2 songs on this record, where he's not the one in charge. House of Pain, just from the title alone, if you read into the lyrics, he's certainly the one calling the shots for this relationship. And the brothers get to close out the album in style, a lot of room to breathe. They get really into their bag for the final bit of this album and sends it out in style. Very interesting also that coming up in rock's constant fight with the media and politics was that the next year would be the time when Dee Snider of Twisted Sister would go into Congress and argue with Tipper Gore about expletive-filled marks on albums, and that she would argue that certain lyrics weren't fit for the children that were consuming the music of that day. And I think it would have been really funny if in 1985, David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen went into Congress and she pulled up the lyrics of House of Pain. That would have been just an all-timer. So that does it for the music side of 1984. All 9 were discussed, and now we're going to go into some categories. Bring out some awards, right? Spinal Tap, crank it up to 11. This is simply the best portion of the album, and 1984 left me with no shortage of choices. The Panama crescendo, how Eddie and Dave were communicating on Hot for Teacher were definitely considered. But I went with Girl Gone Bad, the part that I mentioned earlier of She Don't Work for Free, dun, 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 Girl Gone Bad. And I thought the more I would listen to this record on, not quite a loop, but I listened to it a ton while preparing for this over and over again, the more I found myself gearing up to hear this part of it. And it stuck with me as a very, not only memorable, but awesome, awesome part of 1984. I found myself waiting for it each time. First award given, Girl Gone Bad. Reshuffling history. This is where I talk about if any changes in the album order needed to be made to improve the quality. Honestly, I think 1984 does a great job of balancing out Van Halen entering in this new stage while still staying true to their hard rockin' roots. I think it was smart to go with 1984 and leading that off with Jump to show right away that they were not messing around. They were clearly going into at least introduce a new musical era for the group. But then immediately you go from Jump to Panama, and the hard rocking group that was really at their core of their fan base wouldn't be too annoyed about that, is that they gave them what they wanted right away. They were not abandoning their musical ethos too far. I think the only change that I would make if I had to, and I thought about this a lot, I would flip Girl Gone Bad with House of Pain. I think it would have been a fun dynamic to have the sincere, touching, more emotional David Lee Roth on I'll Wait to go to immediately House of Pain to show off that he really was two sides of the same coin. And also, I think Girl Gone Bad's ending is a little bit more dynamic, and it would have been a slightly better way to round out the album. But having said that, 1984's rhythm of each song in its order goes off very well. I'm a big fan of it. Wouldn't need to change too much of it, honestly. Reprogramming history. This is a part where I mention where the songs that became hits in the time it was released and the songs that people still really mention and associate with the record today, the big songs that should have been the main hits, and also a few underrated parts that should have gotten maybe more pub throughout the decades. And finally, I'll talk about which one song best defines this record. So, the 3 massive hits that, if you know anything about 80s rock, and 80s music really in general, that you would take from this record would be Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher. Those were the 3 songs that had music videos, and honestly, that makes sense that those were the ones that classic rock radio would jump onto, and maybe even occasionally you'd get some 80s softer stations that could 100% play Jump. And it showed that they were entering a new stage while still staying true to their roots and expanding to introducing top 40 elements while still being able to be played on KLOS, the California classic rock station that I listened to growing up, for example. Now, also, I really think that Drop Dead Legs and Girl Gone Bad could have been maybe more prominent hits in their catalog. I was a little bummed that I didn't really know too much about them until I started really diving into their entire musical catalog. And I think it's a little bit of annoying for me. I would have loved to be hearing this stuff more prominently in middle school and high school when I was diving into their stuff. You have to kind of dig a little bit to find out those 2 gems. Hot for Teacher, I am giving the award to number 1 song that best defines this record. It's really close. In my heart of hearts, I would probably pick Panama as the song that I associate the most with this album, to me personally, and the song that I would choose to listen to if I could only have one song off 1984. But Hot for Teacher was a close second, and ultimately I think it did a better job of defining their fun, virtuosity, the chemistry between the group, the suggestive lyrics, the talk-sing dynamics, how they were definitely interested in women, the solos, the monster play, the video. This was the song that if someone asked me about representing what 1984 and Van Halen was at this stage of their career, I would be showing them this video. It's just the guys at the absolute peak of their powers, showing off why they were one of the best American rock bands of all time. Now, jumping into the 5 categories related to the bands that I truly have a special place in my heart for. Pulling Teeth. This is from the underrated, forgotten, overlooked track off Green Day's Dookie. And this song goes to... A couple ones were definitely options for this award. I was really thinking about Girl Gone Bad or Top Jimmy as a song that I thought highlights the underrated qualities of Van Halen, but I decided with Drop Dead Legs, as it really showed their entire elements really firing off. Still soulful shredding of Eddie, the sexy lyrics delivered by Roth. I think the sensuality and the singing with the terrific harmonies also was an added element to this one that really stuck out to me the more I would listen to this record. So, Pulling Teeth given to Drop Dead Legs, the most underrated track off this record, in my opinion. All right, so this next award is This Ain't Havana Award from the Ramones song off End of the Century. And when I listened to that record, that song just blew me away when I listened to it the first time all the way through. And so this award can be given to a song that either blew you away that you remember the first time you heard this record all the way through, or in the most recent listenings that you find yourself looking forward to. And to me, this is going to go with Girl Gone Bad. It was very close. I thought about switching up Drop Dead Legs and Girl Gone Bad for these 2 awards, but I found myself just completely entranced by what Eddie, Michael, Alex, and Dave were really cooking up with on Girl Gone Bad. I love how it builds the pace up to then slow it back down, but I'm still hooked throughout the entire process. There isn't a lull period for me on this one, and the many intricate details of Eddie's guitar play and the different slides that Roth was singing through will basically fill my brain and just always have it be obsessed with finding out more sides of this song. And I was hooked. The more I listened to it, the more I found myself enjoying it and looking for those details that jumped out about, wait, why do I like this song so much? The Highway to Hell Award, shout out to Angus Young. The best musical intro. I mean, when you're dealing with a Van Halen record, basically every song is available for this category. It was close, but I decided to go with Panama. And I never get tired of that incredible driven slide at the start. And the melody guitar rock that Eddie is playing with on this track is one of the best melodies of their entire career, because a lot of times there's so many other intricate details that are riding through Van Halen's recordings that there isn't just one simple rhythm section that is the main reason why you're listening to the song. But for this one, it really is the musical kick from the start. Gets me hooked every single time. It just goes down like a smooth shot of whiskey. And it's one of my favorite guitar intros ever. I would put it up there with Aerosmith's Walk This Way and Black Sabbath's Paranoid and American Idiot. It's just Eddie at the peak of his power, showing why he was really special. The Lithium Award. This is off the Nirvana song from Nevermind. Best opening line. And I decided, after thinking over this was probably the award that didn't jump out to me right away exactly, or at least that I had 1 or 2 categories in mind to choose from. I decided to go with the best opening line off 1984 is Jump's I Get Up and Nothing Gets Me Down. Generally, it sums up the positive attitudes that Roth would kick out on stage and what represented Van Halen as a foursome. And it's one of the best lines in a Van Halen song. And it gives some depth to what really they were all about as not only just musicians, but as people in general. Roth was certainly not going to wait for anybody to show him how to have a good time. The Eruption Award. Best musical extended piece where there's just no singing involved. And again, dealing with a Van Halen song, a lot to choose from. I decided to go with the Hot for Teacher solo, as this song was not only just great from Eddie's standpoint, but I think the drumming underneath Ed's solo by Alex really makes the portion pop even more so and become even more important in their catalog. And it just shows off how connected these guys were as musicians and as brothers, that they would play off each other to an absolute T. And Eddie had a quote one time talking about Alex where he said he wasn't just keeping time. He was making music on the drums. It came so natural. And I think that enjoyment and naturality that they would display through their instruments is just as true as day on Hot for Teachers solo. And even though Eddie is gone, him and his brother, they live on forever with one of the most dynamic and satisfying musical breakdowns in rock history. Now, going to a couple other categories real quick. Tattoo or t-shirt. This is where I decide if there's anything off this album that I would either think would be a cool design for a thing that you would permanently put on your body or at least temporarily. I should shout out the album cover. I really like the smooth album cover with the baby with a coy smile on his face with the cigarettes. Very cool font. I like the album cover a lot. It's maybe not quite as iconic as some of the other ones in rock history, but to me, I really enjoy it. There's a fun image of a Panama single shot of Roth flying through the air with a boombox and his just incredible 80s outfit that I thought would be fun with the Panama font. I think is really cool for that one as well. But I really enjoyed the Hot for Teacher ending of the music video when the four guys had their orange prom suits, extending out their hands and all smiling very, very wide as the track ends. As it really showed that the fun times were at their absolute apex, but they were soon going to be ending for the different groups over the decades. Roth would be out of the band by 1986. Michael Anthony would be replaced eventually and have issues with song royalties. Eddie would be passing away in 2020, and it really showed that this might have been the absolute height of the fun that they were having as a group on and off the stage. And the four of them with their hands out with those big smiles really showed off why they were able to connect with so many people. And it is the pinnacle of their success and their time together. And that is how I want to remember the Van Halen story, not the other issues of infighting and frustration and losing out on money and getting kicked out of the band and feigning with their success and their popularity over time. That's how I want to remember those four guys. A couple other ones before we wind down with the endings. Swipe right if. This is the best pickup line that I found from a lyric on 1984. I really like the one from House of Pain is, I always loved you tender, but you only liked it rough. I don't think that would work as well for me in a Boston bar as it would be for David Lee Roth, especially if he was swinging that out in 1984. But I'm not the lead singer of Van Halen after all, so that one I liked. I thought it was fun. Nobody's Perfect. This is the one that I'll always include for this show is just what song on this record either doesn't hit with you right now, you didn't love it necessarily in the time that you first heard it, that you've gotten a little sick of over, that you flat out just don't like. And I would say that there isn't a song on 1984 that I flat out just do not like. I would ride with I'll Wait for this award because it was the one song that I didn't have downloaded for the longest time from 1984. I'm kind of excluding the intro instrumental because that just bleeds so well into Jump that you almost have to have those connected. And I just, in my core, prefer their hard rock and sound over the synth songs. And I did like Jump's melody and vocal deliveries a little bit more than I'll Wait. And maybe as I mature, I'll start to really appreciate I'll Wait even more. I think I like it more than I did even a few years ago. So if I had to cut one song off 1984, I would choose I'll Wait. Almost Famous. This is a part where I show off a piece that I wrote about why modern music fans should care about this band and this record today. And this is actually taken directly from a long-form feature that I wrote when this record turned 40 in January of 2024 is when I published this. This is titled Full Blast and Top Down. 1984 gave Van Halen a much-needed shot in the arm. 4 decades after its release, it is their second best-selling album of all time, with over 11 million total units purchased. The record stands just a few Amazon shipments away behind Van Halen's self-titled introduction. The band found the right mix of balancing their classic sound and expanding to new horizons, which gave old and new Van Halen fans alike something to smile about. Not many artists, especially rock bands, can claim to have gone diamond more than once. So only 5 bands/artists produced a record that sold at least 10 million copies in both the 1970s and 1980s. This is excluding greatest hits compilations, so the albums had to be original creations. Michael Jackson, Paul Simon, one with and without Art Garfunkel, Fleetwood Mac, Dire Straits and Van Halen were the only musicians to accomplish this feat. Nobody could compete with us, Roth once asserted in an interview, because we were the only ones who would play rock music that you could dance to. MTV sure as hell appreciated 1984, as videos for Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher became regularly scheduled programming for the channel. But as great as those songs are, this album is far from just 3 singles with fun music videos. From beginning to end, you travel on a musical journey with 4 guys at the peak of their creative powers and become engulfed by one of the definitive albums for the second to last decade of the 20th century. In 1984, Van Halen was what America wanted in a rock band. Suggestive lyrics sung by a charm-filled frontman, a 6-string shooter who shredded solos in the rhythm sections with a flair for the amazing, and a group of guys who knew how to have a good time on and off the stage. Van Halen was as important to their time and place as anyone in music history. When Marty McFly decided to introduce 1980s guitar play to a 1950s prom, he mimicked Eddie Van Halen's tendencies. When Jeff Spicoli rescued Brooke Shields from drowning, he paid all his reward money to Van Halen so they could perform at his birthday party. When Bill and Ted wanted the Wild Stallions to be the next big thing in rock, they knew they needed Eddie Van Halen's expertise. Van Halen was the band of their era, and Eddie was the guitar player. They were the archetype for 80s rock and roll, the same way the Beatles and Led Zeppelin were for the 60s and 70s. It was not only about their music, but how they carried themselves as a unit. Unfortunately, the downside of owning your time is you sometimes stay there for the rest of eternity. I'm endlessly fascinated by what cultural points chug along through the decades and which ones get left behind in the dusty drawer of nostalgia. Music, fashion, movies, and other elements can make surges in relevance decades later, while others struggle to carry weight for new tastemakers. And for the majority of modern music fans, Van Halen and their musical ethos got lost in the Spotify shuffle due to multiple changes in the industry. Now, that is not to say that nobody under 40 loves and appreciates Van Halen. I'm in my 20s and have just dedicated roughly 52 minutes and counting to one of their albums. But the idea was emphasized when the uber popular and successful Billie Eilish appeared on the Jimmy Kimmel Live program in November of 2019. Kimmel asked the then 17-year-old musician questions related to the year he was at that age, which was 1984. After she admitted to knowing who Madonna was, Kimmel asked if she knew the first name of a Van Halen. She responded with, "Who?" Kimmel joked, "I'm gonna start crying." I am not criticizing Eilish for not knowing the Van Halen brothers. I'm a little surprised she'd never heard of them, Run DMC or a Cabbage Patch Kid, but that is not the point. That answer, unfortunately, showed just how far Van Halen's popularity had plummeted since their zenith in the 1980s. America's change in its popular music palette corresponded with moving away from what Van Halen was all about. Even the rock genre followed suit. By the time the group moved into the 90s with Sammy Hagar now in lead vocals, rock and roll looked and sounded different. With the alternative wave of bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Green Day, the Foo Fighters, the Smashing Pumpkins, Weezer, and many, many, many others now dominating the rock genre, there was little room left at the table for Van Halen. When you think of these bands, do sensual lyrics describing mesmerizing women come to mind? What about stanzas diving into the perspective of a preening, bombastic male who wants to know where the nearest rager is? No, that is not exactly the themes dug into by Rivers Cuomo. These bands, in different ways and to varying degrees, wrote and continue to write about anxiety, frustration, and the many struggles that accompany us on life. The songwriters are sometimes politically driven, but even if not, they're certainly more socially aware. Women are definitely song topics, but generally not in the same overtly sexual manner that was common in Van Halen's era. Other than being white, handsome, blonde singers in successful American rock bands, can you name something Kurt Cobain and David Lee Roth have in common? And then there's the change in music. Are any of those previous mentioned bands, or any other musical act you can think of who tapped into culture after the 1980s, known for being led by a guitar god? The Red Hot Chili Peppers' John Frusciante is probably the most notable axe wielder in a post-Van Halen world. However, The Peppers did find success without him, and I'm not sure more than 3 people believe Frusciante is a better or more iconic guitar player than Eddie. The Peppers even paid tribute to the departed rocker with a song. No, most of the popular bands in the 90s are cut from the alternative punk cloth. They're not graduates of classic rock university. They are obviously talented guitar players, but shredding solos and finger tapping the neck are not nearly as important as power chords and downstroking. A lot of these bands were or are seen as more empathetic for fans. The musicians were usually not the cool, good-looking guy in school who could play like Jimi Hendrix. A lot of them were awkward or even outcast growing up, and their art reflected that. Youth culture was surging with feelings of disenfranchisement in a post-Reagan America, and those ideas were cultivating in movies, television, and certainly rock and roll. Van Halen comes equipped with many terrific qualities, but relatability is not one of them. You probably don't look like Dave, and you definitely can't play like Eddie. Not to mention the demographics of popular music were broadening. With the increase of black and female artists rising in the 90s and beyond, white rockers with guitar solos and party lyrics were going to have to share more of the spotlight. Mix all those factors together, and Billie Eilish lives the first 17 years of her life without having a relationship with Van Halen's music. And it's not like her playlists are vacant of rock acts. Billie has mentioned how her older brother got her into Green Day when she was growing up. So even though the punk trio released Dookie a mere decade after 1984, the connective tissue feels more appropriate when comparing a carrier pigeon to an iPhone. Having said all of that, Van Halen's 1984 still fucking rules. Even though the record remains a cultural artifact of a bygone era, that does not mean it is meaningless today, tomorrow, or 1,000 years into the future. It takes a listener back to a time where rockers did not need to make sense of the problems the human race was facing. Sometimes you just want to turn your brain off, crank up the volume, roll down your car windows, sing along with Diamond Dave as he flirts with the bodacious teacher of your dreams, and smile, soaking in Eddie Van Halen's masterful demonstration of a guitar solo. That type of music will always serve a purpose in this world. Yes, 1984 is very much of its time, but there is nothing wrong with capturing the cultural zeitgeist of a past era and then settling into history by personifying what a decade sounded like. Maybe that type of rock will return to dominance, and Van Halen will experience a relevance revival by future generations. And if not, the album will always play a critical role in helping mold the soundtrack to that very special time in American history, when Larry Bird was the best basketball player on the planet and Ghostbusters dominated the box office. Damn, we really need to figure out time travel soon. And that does it for this stretch of Don't Scratch the Vinyl, where I'm talking about the record. Awesome job with their entire effort by the 4 guys for this one, and it means a lot that I was able to share my thoughts with this to you for the last almost hour. So before I sign off, just a few housekeeping items I wanted to mention. Please follow along the show. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at DSTVPOD. So the Don't Scratch the Vinyl's initials with pod. Facebook page is Don't Scratch the Vinyl Podcast. I'll be adding clips and additional content to those channels, so please keep an eye out as we continue to grow. I already have the next album shows for the episode. That will be number 3, for those of you keeping track at home. It will be Nirvana's MTV Unplugged in New York. I'm really looking forward to diving headfirst back into that record and the whole Nirvana Kurt Cobain story. There's a lot of meat on that bone, no doubt. That show will be recorded sometime the next couple of weeks. Thanks again for listening. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you got something out of this show if you're a longtime Van Halen fan or did not know much about them before hitting play. Please share along. Family and friends. Every little bit counts as I continue to grow and refine this program. Thanks again for listening. I really enjoyed rambling about one of the best American rock bands in history and one of my personal favorites. It was very special and cool to be able to talk about them for this long, uninterrupted. Please, if you take one thing from the show, remember this. Above all else, you rock. And don't let anyone ever tell you different.
All set to stop recording?
All good.
All right, perfect.